0112 AM, the 14th of January 2026, Tehran. State media carries a line that lands like a trigger pull. The IRGC says it's at peak readiness and its missile stockpiles are larger than before. Hours later, the Gulf reads it as more than rhetoric. At Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, some personnel are advised to leave, in what diplomats call a posture change, not an evacuation. In this kind of standoff, the missiles don't have to fly to start changing behavior. The message is the weapon, and readiness is the fuse. So here's the question. When a force claims bigger stockpiles, who is it really trying to deter? And what happens if deterrence fails? Iran's missile posture exists for one hard reason. It is the fastest way for Tehran to generate credible deterrence without matching US or Israeli air power, plane for plane. Over decades, Iran built a layered approach: ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, and proxy capabilities designed to hold at risk the things its adversaries value most: bases, critical infrastructure, shipping lanes, and decision-makers' sense of control. Reuters has repeatedly described Iran as having the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East, and the program is framed by Iran's leadership as a defensive backbone against superior air forces. That's why a statement like peak readiness and expanded missile stockpiles is not meant to sound inspirational. It's meant to sound mechanical. We can fire, reload, and keep firing. In the Reuters report on the 14th of January 2026, IRGC Aerospace Commander Majid Mousavi claimed any damage from the 2025-1 two-day conflict with Israel had been repaired, and that production capacity had surpassed pre-war levels. Language aimed at one fear: that a first strike can disarm Iran before it responds. But deterrence is never one-sided. The same day, Reuters reported that some personnel at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar were advised to leave in what diplomats explicitly called a posture change, not an evacuation, a signal the USS is adjusting its risk posture while it watches Tehran's messaging and regional temperature rise. So the strategic picture sharpens into a brutal triangle. Iran wants to convince Washington that any strike will trigger retaliation against US bases across the region, including those hosted by neighboring states. The US wants to demonstrate it can absorb threats and still act if it chooses. And Gulf countries hosting US forces while living inside Iranian missile range want to avoid becoming the battlefield by geography alone. Which leads to the central question of this episode. When both sides signal readiness, are they stabilizing the standoff or tightening the spring that makes miscalculation more likely? Point of view A. Before dawn in Tehran, readiness is not a slogan, it's a checklist. In the IRGC aerospace chain, the work is practical and repetitive. Inventory counts, transport schedules, communications, drills, maintenance cycles that don't care about speeches. When Majid Mousavi says damages from last year's fighting were repaired and output is higher than before June 2025, he's trying to kill one assumption in the enemy's mind: that Iran can be hit and silenced before it can respond. Inside that logic, stockpiles aren't just more missiles. Stockpiles are time. How many salvos can be generated before an opponent's pressure breaks your launch tempo? How many launch units can move, hide, and survive the first hours? How quickly can the system replace what gets destroyed? The human reality is colder than the headlines: a crew chief tightening bolts under, fluorescent light, a driver waiting for orders that may never come, a radio operator listening for the single phrase that changes everything. Point of view B. At Al Udeid Air Base, the atmosphere is different, but the mathematics is the same. A posture change is the language of professionals who don't want panic, but don't want surprise either. Some personnel are advised to leave by the evening. No dramatic sirens. No public explanation. Just movement, quiet, deliberate, unmistakable. From the Gulf, every Iranian message gets translated into questions that have deadlines. If Tehran has warned neighbors it would strike US bases if attacked, what does neighbor actually mean in operational terms? Which countries become unwilling buffers simply because geography puts a runway on their soil? And if Washington is adjusting its footprint, is it preparing to defend, preparing to strike, or preparing to keep options open without becoming an easy target? This is where intelligence becomes a nervous system. Analysts watch for patterns, unusual movements, heightened communications, disciplined public rhetoric that suddenly becomes too consistent to be casual. Meanwhile, diplomats trade phrases like imminent and unlikely as if words can slow physics. So here's the hinge point: if both sides are ready, does readiness prevent war, or does it compress the timeline until one misread signal becomes the first launch? The escalation doesn't begin with a launch, it begins with behavior changing. Point of view B. At Al Udeid, the shift is visible in the small things: fewer non-essential bodies on the base, tighter access, a different tempo in the briefings. Diplomats call it a posture change, and that phrase matters because it's meant to do two jobs at once: reduce vulnerability without broadcasting panic. But to anyone watching the region like a chessboard, it's still a move. A base like this is a symbol and a function. Symbol, a reminder, the U. S can project power. Function, a hub that makes projection possible. So when posture shifts, adversaries don't ask why, they ask what next. Is it defensive tightening, hardening against a possible Iranian strike? Or is it pre-positioning, making the footprint lighter because the US wants freedom of action? One quiet decision starts a chain. If the US is adjusting, regional partners recalibrate. Governments hosting US forces look at their own vulnerabilities, a runway, a fuel farm, a radar site, targets that don't need to be destroyed to create strategic effects. Iran has already warned that if it is attacked, it could hit US bases in neighboring states. That means escalation isn't only a US-Iran problem, it's a host nation problem. Point of view A. In Tehran, the rhetoric about peak readiness is deliberately structured. It isn't poetry. It's industrial language, repair damage, increased production, larger stockpiles. The goal is to make deterrence sound like arithmetic. The message to Washington is, you don't get a clean first strike. Even if you hit launch sites, there are more missiles, more ways to fire, more time to keep pressure on. But the real escalation comes from what that message forces the other side to plan for. If the US believes Iran can generate larger salvos, missile defense becomes a budgeting problem and a decision problem. You can't intercept everything forever. You protect the highest value assets first, and the attacker knows that. Deterrence becomes a contest of priorities: which targets matter most, which costs are acceptable, which losses change policy. That's how a standoff tightens without a single missile leaving a rail. The region begins living on short notice, commanders shorten reaction windows, intelligence shops hunt for signs that readiness is turning into execution. Shipping operators, airlines, and insurers read the same signals and start pricing risk. Even civilians feel it indirectly: fuel purchases, supply stocks, public alerts, because modern escalation leaks into daily life faster than it used to. And here's the most dangerous part. Once both sides start moving pieces, to avoid being caught flat-footed, every move can be misread as preparation to strike. A defensive posture can look like offensive positioning. A public statement meant to deter can look like a threat that demands a response. The cycle feeds itself. So the central question of missiles isn't whether Iran has more rockets in storage, it's whether the claim paired with visible changes on the U.S. side pushes the region into a tighter loop, where a single misinterpretation becomes the first irreversible step. Point of view B. The defensive response starts with a principle that sounds simple and feels brutal: reduce what can be hit and harden what must stay. A posture change is the first layer: fewer people concentrated in one place, fewer predictable routines, fewer soft targets. The base shifts into a tighter rhythm: dispersed parking, stricter movement windows, more redundancy in communications. Not because anyone wants war, but because in missile warfare, predictability is a vulnerability. Then comes the second layer: air and missile defense triage. Defenders don't think in slogans like "stop all missiles." They think in defended assets: runways, fuel farms, command nodes, radar, the things that keep the base functional after the first shock. That list isn't public, and it changes as the situation shifts. If the threat is a short warning salvo, reaction time matters. If the threat is a prolonged pressure campaign, endurance matters: interceptors, crews, maintenance, resupply. Point of view A. On Iran's side, the defensive posture looks different, but it follows the same logic: survivability, dispersal, mobility, decoys, hardening. The aim is to make any strike uncertain and to ensure a response remains possible even after damage. That's the hidden meaning behind stockpile talk. Deterrence is not only what you can fire, it's what you can still fire after you've been hit. And that leads to the real dilemma. If both sides are defending by preparing to absorb the first blow, how close are they to creating the exact conditions where the first blow becomes more likely? When IRGC leaders talk about expanded stockpiles, the scary part isn't a single missile type, it's the system. That stockpiles imply more rounds available, more launch options, and more chances to overwhelm defenses over time. Reuters quoted IRGC Aerospace Commander Majid Mousavi saying, "The force is at peak readiness, damage from last year's 12-day war was repaired, and production has surpassed pre-war levels," language designed to signal endurance after a first strike. Technically, Iran's missile portfolio is built to create multiple dilemmas. Solid-fueled ballistic missiles matter because solid fuel supports faster readiness, less visible pre-launch activity compared to older liquid fuel workflows. A missile like the Sagil is commonly described as a solid propellant MRBM, with an approximate 2,000 kilometers range and a payload around 700 kilograms, giving Iran a reach narrative even when the immediate crisis is local. Below that tier are shorter-range solid fuel systems in the Fateh family, such as the Zulfahar, often sighted around the 700 kilometers range, useful for regional basing geometry because they can threaten a wide arc of fixed facilities without needing strategic range weapons. But bigger stockpiles are also about salvo logic. Missile defense is not a magic shield, it's a resource management fight. Defenders prioritize defended assets, runways, fuel farms, command nodes because interceptors are finite and expensive. The attacker's counter is volume, timing, and mixed threats ballistic, plus drones, plus cruise profiles to force hard choices. That's why Reuters' report of a posture change at Al Udeid airbase matters in the same conversation as stockpiles. If planners believe the probability of a large strike package rises, they reduce exposure and tighten the timeline for decisions without declaring war. So the technical bottom line is blunt missiles don't need to launch to generate effects. They only need to make the other side act as if they might. And once both sides are acting on worst-case assumptions, how much room is left for de-escalation before one defensive move looks like the first step of an attack? The immediate impact of a missile readiness claim is not measured in crater sizes. It's measured in how fast the region's decision cycle tightens. First, it changes posture without a shot fired. Reuters reporting that personnel were advised to leave Al Udeid as part of a posture change shows what deterrence messaging can trigger: quieter footprints, higher alert levels, and fewer mistakes tolerated. In missile warfare, routine is risk, so routine gets stripped away. Second, it drags host nations into the threat geometry. Iran's warning reported by Reuters that it could target US bases in neighboring countries if attacked turns Gulf capitals into unwilling stakeholders in every US-Iran decision, even if those governments want neutrality. Geography and basing make neutrality fragile. Third, it reshapes what escalation looks like in 2026. Escalation is no longer only about visible strikes, it's about the expectation of strikes. Airlines reroute, insurers reprice, shipping operators hesitate. Military planners shift from deterrence to endurance. How long can defenses stay ready? How quickly can systems recover? How much uncertainty can commanders carry before someone chooses preemption over patience? And that is the strategic trap. If both sides conclude that waiting increases vulnerability, the incentive to move first rises, even when neither side actually wants a wider war. So the real consequence of missiles is psychological and operational at the same time. A region runs hotter, faster, and closer to the edge, because the possibility of a salvo becomes a governing fact. What happened on the 14th of January 2026 wasn't a missile strike. It was something more subtle and sometimes more dangerous, a public claim of peak readiness paired with a visible shift in how the other side protects itself. Iranian state media carried IRGC aerospace commander Majid Mousavi's message that missile stockpiles are larger. Damage from last year's 12-day war was repaired, and production has surpassed pre-war levels. On the same day, 3 diplomats told Reuters that some personnel were advised to leave Al Udeid airbase in Qatar, described as a posture change, not an evacuation. And Reuters also reported Iranian warnings to regional countries that US Prasan bases on their soil could be struck if Iran is attacked, turning geography into strategy, whether those governments like it or not. So the real missiles story is this: deterrence is now a contest of endurance and perception. Stockpiles matter, but so does the belief that stockpiles exist, and the speed at which that belief forces militaries, diplomats, airlines, and host nations to act under tighter timelines. If everyone is moving pieces just to be safe, the risk is that safety starts looking like preparation for war on both sides. Now here's the question I want to leave you with. Do these signals stabilize the standoff, or do they shorten the fuse for the first real launch? Bye for now.